Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 386. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of important news to talk about this morning. Biden is in Kiev meeting with Zelensky, so this is a very high profile and important meeting. We'll get into that and a lot more about the U.S. war supporting Ukraine. So let's get into it. And first up, I don't have like an article here because this is pretty much breaking news. The White House just put out a press release. Biden is in Kiev meeting with Zelensky. Of course, we don't get any notification ahead of time of this. That actually, I think, makes sense from a logistical and security, uh, you know, stance of Biden. This is probably discussed only at the highest levels. No real indication that this is going to happen before it happens. So Biden's in Kiev. He meets with Zelensky. He gets out of town, and that's when I guess we get a lot of the press releases. While there, Biden pledged another $500 million in weapons to Ukraine. And we'll talk about this as we go through the show today, but kind of as expected, this isn't as big of a weapons package as the previous few that have been announced, and it doesn't include any new weapon systems, so no long-range missiles or anything like that. With that, I also want to mention that Zelensky said if China starts supporting Russia in the war, this will mean World War III. Now, I don't think necessarily China has to be involved for this to break into World War III. I think just a larger conflict between Russia and NATO would likely lead us to World War III. China, the Beijing involvement could be different than what Zelensky says, but it does sound like Ukraine is kind of making a threat towards China, like, hey, if you support Russia here, that means that we're coming after you. And of course, Zelensky, Ukraine have no ability, right, to wage war against China whatsoever. But NATO does. American partners do. Other countries that support Ukraine, at least ostensibly, Australia, Japan, South Korea, they do have abilities to, launch either assaults on China or try to make China pay in some way. And of course, the Americans being the big party here. And so hopefully this is just Zelensky running his mouth and, he didn't hear something for Biden that makes him feel comfortable making that threat. Now let's move on. And the first article I had today is from Ted Snyder, who, as I think I've said this on the show multiple times, but probably not enough, but along with Ted Galen Carpenter, Ted Snyder, I think, has been the most important writer in America over the past year throughout this war in Ukraine. The detailed research he does, the points that he makes. I would say Branko March-Teach has also done a lot of really good work. And there's probably 10 other people I could point to. But as far as the volume, how much they're writing, how great that writing is, and how important it is, really nobody other than Ted Snyder and Ted Galen Carpenter are doing that work. And I'm very lucky to be involved in that antiwar.com team that publishes a lot of their work. So on Ukraine, is Biden signaling that as long as it takes may have an end date? There seems to be a lot of talk today about scaling back territorial expectations, a move towards the negotiating table. And again, this is Ted writing on February 16th. So this is, before Biden goes to Kiev. But I think when I piece all this together, it's gonna make a lot of sense as to what is happening in the White House right now. So, in his State of Union address on February 7th, President Biden once again promised Ukraine that America will stand with you for as long as it takes. But privately, 1 year into the war, the Biden administration appears to be telling Ukraine that as long as it takes may be running out. 1 week after the State of the Union, the Washington Post quoted a senior administration official as saying, "We will continue to try to impress upon them that we cannot do anything and everything forever." The senior administration official said continue because in January, CIA William Burns met with Ukrainian President Zelensky and told him, according to the Washington Post account, that at some point the assistance would be harder to come by, People familiar with the meeting said Zelensky walked away from the meeting with the impression that he could rely on the U.S. assistance through the summer, but was less certain about the prospects of Congress passing another multi-billion-dollar supplemental assistance package as it did last spring. That timeline was reinforced by the Post reporting that the Biden and his top aides warned that the political path will get tougher once Ukraine has exhausted its current congressional package, which could happen as early as this summer. Now, stepping away from Ted's article, a little my own analysis here. I'm not quite so sure the Biden administration has to be that concerned, or even if they're really concerned that Congress won't pass this. We do have members of Congress. There's about 11 Republicans now who have signed on to Matt Gaetz's bill about the Ukraine act that would it's a resolution, so it's not a bill, but it would basically just send the signal to the White House that the consensus of the House of Representatives is that the American people are becoming tired of supporting this war and that we shouldn't be giving Ukraine new aid, and instead we should be pushing Kiev to engage in talks with Moscow. So there are a minority of Republicans who do have that position. However, if you look at the majority of the Republican caucus and the entirety of the Democratic caucus, they are 100% on this war. So I really, just because there's a few members of Congress that are going to take issue with providing more aid, I don't think that's necessarily going to stop that aid from getting to Ukraine. Now, I do wonder if maybe the White House is very concerned that those representatives and senators like Rand Paul and Mike Lee, anybody else who may be skeptical about this war, skeptical about the U.S. military aid, may now be working towards having enough political leverage to stick real oversight in any future aid package to Ukraine. So look, maybe they can't stop the next $40 billion aid package, but if that aid package says that there's going to be a detailed tracking and accounting system, or establishing an office like the Special Investigative General for Afghan Reconstruction, who did really, really good work throughout that war. And, a lot of the reports that even the great experts on the war like Matthew Ho or Scott Horton will use in their analysis and in explaining the war comes from that office, who put together these detailed reports saying like, hey, we're paying the Taliban here. This is why this policy isn't effective. And so there's, I guess, probably concern in the White House that any future aid package will come with, some more strings attached and some more oversight. And maybe that will cause the aid to Ukraine to dry up because there's a lot of corruption going on here. So back to Ted's article, the senior official redefined the Biden administration's promise, saying, as long as it pertains to the amount of conflict, it doesn't pertain to the amount of assistance, which is incredibly a crazy statement to make, right? When you're saying that, we'll keep giving you moral and verbal support, but, the amount of assistance that actually does have an end date, then what you're telling Ukraine is that their entire, support network does have an end date. The timeline suggests the urgency of the moment. The Post report that the critical nature of the next few months has already been conveyed to Kiev in blunt terms by top administration officials, including Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner, Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, and Undersecretary of Defense Colin Powell, all of whom visited Ukraine in the last month. The coming months will be critical for Ukraine to retake as much territory as possible before sitting down at the negotiating table. The goal is to take back as much territory as possible sounds like a concession that Kiev may not claim its goal of reclaiming all of its territory. At the end of the war, Ukraine will be divided. The frank discussions in Kiev last month, the Post reports reflected at effort by the Biden administration to bring Ukraine's goals in line with that of the West, that the West can sustain. And then this is, that too is a recent refrain. In November, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told Zelensky to start thinking in terms of realistic demands and priorities for negotiations, including a reconsideration of its stated aim for Ukraine to regain Crimea. A divided Ukraine will likely mean a post-war Ukraine without Crimea. U.S. intelligence officials have concluded that retaking the heavily fortified peninsula is beyond the capability of Ukraine's army. That sobering assessment, the Post reports, has been reiterated to multiple committees on Capitol Hill over the last several weeks. And, this is something that we discussed on the show from the beginning, that they were never going to retake Crimea, that Ukraine was never going to take any of this territory in the Donbass, and likely won't get very much, if any, territory back from what Russia captured from its initial invasion. Now, Ukraine made some significant gains during their fall offensive, and they retook some territory. However, in recent weeks, the momentum has actually been on the Russian side, and they've slowly been taking territory along the line of control. And while this hasn't come at maybe a fast pace, there is a lot of analysts out there who point to the fact that Russia is actually the one ramping up for an offensive here. And so this is one of the confusing parts of the Post report, where it seems like the White House is continuing to live in an unreality where they believe that, Ukraine is going to take back more territory and then negotiate. But in reality, from now in the spring, it looks like Kiev is actually going to lose more Ukrainian territory to Russia. All right, so back to Ted's article here. The New York Times also reported last month that the Biden administration does not think that Ukraine can retake Crimea militarily. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, has said for this year, it would be very, very difficult for the military to eject Russian forces from every inch of Russian-occupied Ukraine. Even Kiev may accept that regaining Crimea by military force may be impossible. The acceptance by the Biden administration that by the end of the war, Ukraine will be divided is also reflected in a Newsweek report that Burns secretly traveled to Moscow last month with a peace plan that would end the Russian war. Would end the war with Russia keeping 20% of Ukraine's territory. The report, which was denied by the White House, may or may not be true, but it may have caught the wind of the mood in Washington. Burns may have explored the idea of a peace plan that involved Russia withdrawing to its February 24th borders, an idea that had been suggested by Secretary of State Antony Blinken in December, that would leave Russia in possession of the Crimean Peninsula and parts of the Donbass. Now, I really, really don't believe that would be an acceptable deal to Russia. I think at the very least, the Sea of Azov is going to remain essentially a Russian lake in the future. And that means Mariupol in that region from Crimea. I think this is mostly the Zaporizhia region of Ukraine to the Donbass region. I think the Luhansk is the southern region of the Donbass. So I do think all that is going to essentially be taken by Russia at the end of this war, that Ukraine isn't getting that back. And so the February 24th borders from a year ago, I don't really think are possible grounds to negotiate on this war at this point. However, maybe it is a starting point. Russia's going to say, no, this is our map. And Ukraine's going to look at it, be really upset, and say, you know what, we could live with this. The report suggests that the division of Ukraine may be the only way forward. After a realistic appraisal of the military facts on the ground, conceding that the partition of Ukraine as a part of the negotiated settlement would be consistent with the settlement Russia and Ukraine had reportedly tentatively agreed to in Istanbul in April 2022, that had Russia maintained possession of Crimea and parts of the Donbass, it would also be consistent with historical referendums in the Donbass and Crimea. And so this is, I think, one of the great tragedies of this war in Ukraine, is that the U.S. could negotiate with Russia in November and December of 2021 and avoided this conflict completely. But if we, get to the point where we're at February 24th, the war starts, there's actually negotiations in March headed by Turkey and the UN that nearly successfully brokered a peace agreement. And Boris Johnson, this is well documented, went to Kiev, talked to Zelensky, and told him that even if Ukraine is willing to settle, the West isn't. Your Western backers are not willing to settle. And after that, they started dumping a massive amount of weapons in Ukraine. And then American officials, Biden, Lloyd Austin, Blinken, and others made it very clear that this war wasn't about helping Ukraine to recapture its territory. It was about weakening Russia. And so, anyways, fantastic article by Ted here is running as the spotlight today at antiwar.com. He finishes here. The Biden administration appears to understand that as long as the Tates has an expiration date and that Kiev will have to accept a divided Ukraine with Crimea lost to Russia and parts of the Donbass outside of its control. The tragedy is the map would have looked similar had the negotiated settlement been agreed to in the first weeks of the war or even before the war began. And I think actually, maybe Ted understates it just a little bit there. And I would go further to say that Ukraine has lost a lot more than just soldiers and infrastructure and civilians and money in this war, but has also, will end up giving up more territory than they would have had they taken that April or March-April deal of 2022. Now, this article I wrote for antiwar.com on February 19th. U.S., France, UK divided on support for Ukraine. British Prime Minister Sunak said London will be the first country to send long-range missiles to Kiev. Meanwhile, statements from top American and French officials indicate support for Ukraine in Washington and Paris may be weakening. At the Munich Security Conference, the British Prime Minister said Ukraine must win the war. During his speech, the British leader called on other Western leaders to double down on their support for Kiev. A different message is coming out of the White House. Last week, the Washington Post reported that senior administration officials said, "We will continue to impress upon them that they can't do everything forever." Last month, William Burns told the Ukrainian President Zelensky in a secret meeting at some point assistance would be harder to come by. And then I mentioned here the political situation in Congress. Still, the British Prime Minister says London will press ahead. On Sunday in Munich, he announced the United Kingdom will be the first country to provide Ukraine with longer range weapons. He continued, and is why we're working with our allies to give Ukraine the most advanced air defense systems and build the air force they need to defend their nation. And so that comment right there, build the air force they need to defend their nation, there's not a ton of elaboration on there. He does mention in his speech that the UK is the first country to train Ukrainian pilots on Western planes. That's important, but I do wonder if, that statement is indicating that the UK is looking at pressing ahead with giving Ukraine NATO-made warplanes sometime in the coming year. He pointed to London's ability to push its NATO partners to send arms to Ukraine during his speech. "We became the first country to provide tanks," he said. On January 14th, London said it would send its advanced Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. However, and this is kind of fact-checking the British Prime Minister's speech, Poland, had previous pledges said the German-made Leopard 2 tanks to Kiev. So he's definitely stretching the truth when he claims that he was the first to send tanks, but it's a little bit nuanced. It's the first of, between Germany and the U.S., France and the UK and everything. After the British announcement on tanks, Washington and Berlin agreed to send M1 Abrams tanks and Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. Germany then agreed to send up to additional 178 Leopard 1 tanks. And so, we saw a deluge of, pledges to give tanks to Ukraine. And while I do think Poland more start that trend than the UK was certainly an early adopter. And so, it is, I think, when the UK pledges to give these things, it does push Berlin, Paris, and Washington to act, as he is saying in his speech. He went on to claim that Putin's strategy is to split the alliance, but sticking together will break Moscow's resolve. When Putin started this war, he believed that our resolve would falter. Even now, he is betting that we will lose our nerves. He continued, "We will prove him wrong now." Sunak went on to say that the alliance should extend its security guarantees to Kiev to help Ukraine defend itself again and again. Providing such assurances to Kiev will cross Russian red lines and drive Moscow closer to conflict with the North Atlantic Alliance. French President Emmanuel Macron said parents wanted to avoid conflict with Russia in an interview that was published on Saturday. "I do not think, as some people do, that we must aim for the total defeat of Russia attacking Russia on its own soil. Those observers want to, above all else, crush Russia." He added, "That has never been the position of France, and it will never be our position." And so again, I think you could see kind of the tiers of support, and we heard something very similar, in other reporting that before this war started, France and Germany really wanted to continue to negotiate with Russia. The UK didn't want to negotiate at all, and apparently Biden sat in the middle. And so I think we're seeing some of this here where, Macron is the least interested in fighting this war against Russia, this proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. The British are trying to lead the charge and push the Americans to do more. And Biden is waffling right now, but has, continued to get drug along through all of this. All right, this from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com on February 16th. Blinken warns attempting to retake Crimea is a red line for Putin. Secretary of State Antony Blinken on Wednesday warned that a Ukrainian attempt to retake the Crimea would be a red line for Russian President Vladimir Putin and risk a major response. Politico reported that Biden made the comments during a Zoom call on Wednesday with Blinken, not Biden, made the comments on a Zoom call Wednesday with a group of experts in discussion about the war, citing four unnamed people familiar with the call. Blinken's comments mark a potential shift in the Biden administration's thinking about Crimea, while the Pentagon doesn't think Ukraine has a chance of retaking Crimea. The New York Times reported last month that the administration still wanted to help Ukraine attack the peninsula and wasn't concerned about escalating the war. And I do believe that, as far as my understanding right now, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, is one of the Biden administration officials that is concerned with punishing Russia over the invasion of Crimea, where others in the administration, I think Antony Blinken counted among them, is actually more concerned about China at this point and wants to not wrap up the war in Ukraine to get to the war in Taiwan, but, does see that, like what a lot of American military officials have been saying, it's kind of impossible to arm both Ukraine and Taiwan at the same time. And Taiwan is losing out on weapons that are going to Ukraine. So this is something of an issue, I guess. Although, again, I don't want to escalate the war in Taiwan. I don't think we should be sending weapons there. Putin has shown a willingness to significantly escalate the war over attacks in Crimea. Russia did not start large-scale missile attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure until after the truck bombing of the Kerch Bridge, which connects Crimea to the mainland Russia. According to Politico's sources, Blinken made the comments when asked if the administration was willing to help Ukraine achieve its goal of taking Crimea, which Russia has controlled since 2014. They said that Blinken conveyed that the U.S. isn't actively encouraging Ukraine to retake the peninsula, but said that it's Kiev's decision whether to do so or not. Ukrainian officials still maintain they will drive Russia out of the peninsula, but the Pentagon recently told members of Congress that it's unlikely. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, has publicly said it's doubtful that Ukraine will be able to drive Russia out of all the territory it controls by the end of this year. And so, there is another interesting point to be made here, that the people of Crimea have voted to join the Russian Federation. And there is, a lot of observers of those polls that suggest, this isn't just made up, that even if the initial resolution to retake or the initial vote after Crimea was taken by Russia, maybe that was somewhat flawed. It did generally bat the consensus of the people there, and you could look at other indicators too, like 50% of the Ukrainian military on the Crimea just defected and joined Russia, just put on new uniforms. They ain't even leave the peninsula. And so, with that in mind, I think it's pretty clear that the people of Crimea would see themselves as being conquered by the Ukrainian army, not liberated by it, which is a major problem with that offensive, other than, potentially escalating towards nuclear war with Russia. All right, this from Connor Freeman at antiwar.com. Great article here. Washington plans fresh sanctions on Russia, key industries targeted. The White House is readying a raft of new sanctions and export controls to impose on Russia as the war in Ukraine turns 1 year old, according to Bloomberg. The coming new penalties are said to be focused on targeting key Russian industries, as well as so-called sanctions circumvention or businesses conducted with Russian firms by individuals based in third countries. The measures are looking to target Russian financial institutions as well as energy and defense sectors. People familiar with the new sanctions package told the outlet. The EU seeks to approve a new set of measures next week and is considering forcing banks to report Russian assets they hold as well. Last week, Swedish Prime Minister said that the bloc is looking to form a group to identify frozen Russian funds, which will be used to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, an unprecedented step. And this, I think, is very concerning because it's going to make sure there's a perpetual resolution. Even if Ukraine and Russia could resolve the war at this point, even if they could, establish some sort of line of control, some sort of new borders between the new countries, and, a meaningful peace breaks out, it doesn't seem that we're going to see that between the West and Moscow anytime soon, because Moscow is going to feel like they had a lot of their assets stolen. I mean, this is essentially why the U.S. maintains an embargo on Cuba decades later, is because they say they had to return the American assets, which I'm sure are far smaller than the Russian assets that have been seized and that they want to use here. All right. The Bloomberg report said the EU package aims to target Iranian entities as well, which are accused of providing drones and other military goods to Russia. However, Tehran has reportedly stated it stopped providing drones to Russia after the war in Ukraine was launched. Additionally, the EU measures are said to be eyeing extensive trade controls on other goods used by Russia's military, including technologies, components, heavy vehicles, electronics, and rare earths. The Bloomberg report says the group of 7 nations and the European Union intend to boost cooperation in the economic war against Russia with a renewed focus on enforcement of existing restrictions, including compelling nations that haven't adopted the measures, as well as the companies meant to implement the measures. These new efforts come as more evidence mounts that the U.S.-led sanctions blitz against Russia has failed. Russia has overtaken Saudi Arabia as China's top crude supplier. Indian exports of Russian oil are three times higher than they were a year ago, and Russia's oil exports last month are higher than any time during 2021. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen promised Russia was isolated and the ruble was in free fall, though Forbes reported last year that even after crashing following Russia's invasion in February, the ruble is one of the best performing currencies against the dollar in 2022, gaining nearly 30% value year to date. And so this is just like the propaganda campaign on the American part to always claim, oh, our sanctions are working, our sanctions are working, our sanctions are crushing this country. And sometimes, the sanctions do crush some of the people in these countries. We see this in Syria, Iran during the pandemic, particularly Venezuela, where people are suffering and dying under American sanctions. They don't have food, they don't have electricity, they lack a lot of basic necessity, medical, medicines, stuff like that. That are restricted because of the U.S. sanctions. However, if you look at, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, Cuba, all these governments have been under sustained U.S. sanctions for, I guess Iran isn't quite a decade because there was a couple year break there, but they've been under sustained U.S. sanctions for a decade, and all these governments are still in place. And so the sanctions really don't work to punish the governments in particular. They haven't in any way seemed to slow or stop the Russian war machine in Ukraine. However, it is dividing the world. We've seen this with statements by the Iranian president Ibrahim Raisi when he was at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and identifying that now half of the world is a part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. A lot of those countries are sanctioned, and every time the U.S. sanctions a new country, it just brings them into this new fold. And the U.S. and the European economies, the Japanese economies, yeah, they're still a large part of the world powerhouses, but these groups of countries that don't follow the West's international global order, they don't partake in all the West sanctions. So you have like groups like BRICS, or you look at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or anything like all these kind of other groups. They're rapidly growing. They're half the world's population, a quarter of the world's economies. And as the U.S. tries to sanction more and more countries, they're just going to join within that block and circumvent U.S. sanctions pretty easily. Next up, Dave DeCamp, February 19th. Finland reverses course, says it will join NATO without Sweden. Finnish officials said they would join NATO without Sweden if Turkey approves their membership, reversing a previous position that they would only join together with Stockholm. The comments come after the Turkish Turkish leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Sweden wouldn't receive the support from Ankara over a Quran burning protest that was held in front of the Turkish embassy in Sweden. Erdogan also said Turkey could approve Finland without Sweden. So this is an interesting change of course. I wonder how it will be received within Turkey. I think it's possible that, or within Sweden, and Finland, because I think some of the popularity of this amongst the people was that, this was happening together. So if it's not happening together, that could change some, citizens' calculations on how much they support this. All right, next up, I wrote this article for antiwar.com on February 19th. Top Republicans press Biden to increase military aid to Taiwan. 4 high-ranking Republicans in Congress sent a letter to President Joe Biden demanding more military aid for Taiwan. In their letter, the legislators claimed the White House is not doing enough to respond to the growing threat from Beijing. The 4 congressmen who signed on to the letter hold powerful committee appointments. Representative Mike Rogers, who is the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, and Michael McCall, the chairman of the House's Foreign Affairs Committee. And then we have U.S. Senators Roger Wicker, ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Jim Risch, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The letter lambasts the White House for failing to act against Chinese threats. Your national security strategy identified China as a top geopolitical challenge facing the United States. The statement continues, however, your administration has consistently failed to act with the serious urgency needed to arm and equip Taiwan. In the letter, the members claim that Biden did not respond aggressively enough to a Chinese balloon that traveled over American airspace. The Pentagon asserts that the craft never presented a threat to Americans. The White House ordered the military to shoot down the balloon after it had blown over the Atlantic Ocean. Beijing says the craft is merely a weather balloon for scientific purposes that flew over the U.S. after it blew off course. The Pentagon says it tracked the balloon after it took off from Chinese territory and it was blown off course by unexpected storms. While some American legislators speculate the balloon could present a threat to Americans, the U.S. government has not provided evidence that the balloon was any kind of military or surveillance craft. Over the past decade, the relationship between Washington and Beijing has deteriorated. Still, the 4 congressmen say the White House should continue to strengthen its military relationship with Taiwan. The legislators acknowledge that providing more military aid to Taipei will provoke Beijing, but the members do not believe the hostility with China should deter a greater American military relationship with Taiwan. And this is from the letter. The United States must not be deterred from taking meaningful actions to counter the CCP objectives that threaten our interests. We must be willing to accept that tensions that come with supporting Taiwan amidst Chinese threats and aggression, and we must match words with action. In the letter, the legislators called for Biden to add $2 billion in military aid to Taipei in the form of a grant rather than a loan. The loan would require Taiwan to pay back the U.S. government. The White House is expected to submit its budget proposal for the fiscal year ending in September 2024 on March 9th. Recently, the White House officially warned that the lack of contact between Beijing and Washington is becoming dangerous. The balloon incident earlier in the month further eroded ties between China and the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was set to travel to China in early February for a meeting with his counterpart and President Xi. However, Blinken scrapped his plans after the Chinese balloon was spotted over Montana. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was unable to reach the Chinese defense minister on bilateral hotline after a F-22 downed the craft. Defense official Eli Ratner claimed Beijing's cold shoulder was dangerous. Biden has repeatedly aggravated Beijing by saying the U.S. will defend Taiwan if China invades. The statements violate the One China policy that has guided the Washington-Beijing relationship for decades. Beijing views Taiwan as a breakaway region and American support for Taipei as interference in an internal Chinese matter. Last summer, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi traveled to Taipei. The visit by a high-level American official enraged China, prompting Beijing to order massive war games around the island. Current House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is planning to replicate Pelosi's provocative trip. On Friday, a high-ranking American defense official traveled to Taiwan. The Department of Defense did not confirm the visit. At the time of writing, I didn't see a response from China on that visit, and at times I feel like Chinese responses to these kind of provocative things, they wait until there's some kind of official or semi-official confirmation. So we get reports in the Washington Post from high-ranking White House officials or things like that. At that point, we may see a response from China, but they may even wait until we get some kind of confirmation from the White House saying that this actually happened. So Blinken did end up meeting with the Chinese foreign minister. This from Connor Freeman, February 19th at antiwar.com. Blinken warns Chinese foreign minister against providing military support to Russia. Amid simmering tensions between Washington and Beijing, Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi at the Munich Security Conference on Saturday. And by the way, the Munich Security Conference is where the British Prime Minister pledged the long-range weapons. I'm not sure if Macron made the statement at the Munich Security Conference or if that article was just published while he was there. And then also significantly, there were about, I think, 10,000 German protesters outside, demanding that the support for Ukraine end. After the White House ordered the U.S. military to shoot down the Chinese balloon which flowed over the continental U.S., there was a major breakdown in diplomacy. Previously, U.S. officials suggested Blinken would take advantage of the opportunity to help de-escalate the situation and reach some quasi-detente. Instead, Blinken confronted Wang over the balloon incident and warned China against providing weapons for Russia use in Ukraine. This was an opportunity to speak very clearly and very directly about the fact that China has sent a surveillance balloon over our territory, violating our sovereignty, violating international law. And I told him quite simply that was unacceptable and can never happen again. Blinken told NBC's Meet the Press without providing further details about the meeting. Blinken said, "I could tell you no, there was no apology." And of course, so he's saying that this can never happen again. What even the Pentagon acknowledges that this only happened because of a weather incident. After the Pentagon announced the Chinese balloon had entered U.S. airspace and that posed no threat to Americans, Blinken canceled his long-planned trip to China, where he would have met with Wang and possibly Xi. And I already mentioned that in my article. Though the Department of Defense claims without evidence that it was a surveillance device, Beijing maintains that it was a meteorological balloon for civilian purposes only, and that it entered U.S. airspace as a result of abnormal weather. Last week, the Washington Post also reported that unexpected weather blew the balloon off course, adding U.S. intelligence and military agencies tracked the balloon since it was launched from Hainan Island, China's southernmost province. They expected the balloon to travel over Guam, where the U.S. Marine Corps is opening a new base, part of Washington's new Asia pivot, apparently launched during the Barack Obama administration to encircle China in preparation for a future war, the largest military buildup since World War II. The balloon was shot down by an F-22 on February 4th, after which Pentagon Chief Lloyd Austin was declined a call to his Chinese counterpart on Wednesday. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin declared Washington's actions have had a grave impact on efforts and progress made by China and the U.S. in stabilizing bilateral relations. President Joe Biden met with Xi in Bali last fall. Beijing said that the U.S. had at least 10 high-altitude balloons that have flown over its territory in the last year. Wang also pointed to the heavy U.S.-American military presence in the waters surrounding China, saying the U.S. military vessels and aircraft conduct frequent close-in reconnaissance on China, and including 657 sorties last year and 64 sorties in January this year in South China Sea alone, which seriously undermines China's national security and regional peace and stability. Blinken says he emphasized Washington's deep concern over information he claims the U.S. that shows China is considering providing lethal assistance to Moscow as well. We've been watching this very, very closely, and for the most part, China has been engaged in providing rhetorical, political, diplomatic support for Russia, but we have information that gives us concern that they are considering providing lethal support for Russia in the war against Ukraine. We see China considering this. We have not seen them cross that line. He asserted, we are concerned that this is something China was not doing for many months, but now may be considering doing. Adding that if China crosses that line, it would spark a new Cold War, where Zelensky called it a new world war. Blinken said if the U.S. is only sharing intelligence with its allies right now, and implied it reveals a sudden shift in China's posture regarding the war in Ukraine. In response to a question about how lethal support is defined, Blinken clarified everything from ammunition to the weapons themselves. To date, we have seen Chinese companies, and of course in China, there is really no distinction between private companies and the state. There really isn't in the American either. We have seen at least in the military-industrial complex sense. We have seen them provide non-lethal support to Russia for use in Ukraine. These concerns that we have now seen is based on information that they are considering providing lethal support. Earlier this month, the Wall Street Journal reported that Russia custom record shows Chinese state defense companies shipping navigation equipment, jamming technology, and jet fighter parts to sanctioned Russian government-owned defense companies. That report also discussed other dual-use goods making their ways from to Russia from Chinese companies, both state-owned and private. If Blinken's unverified claims prove to be true, this would mark a significant shift in China's foreign policy, as Ted Snyder has explained in the past. At the same time, in addition to the new Marine bases in Guam, the U.S. has been greatly increasing its military pressure on China. In recent weeks and months, the U.S. has sailed guided missile destroyers through the sensitive Taiwan Strait, committed billions of dollars in military aid to Taiwan, expanded the U.S. National Guard training programs with the Taiwanese military, worked on deals to gain extensive military assets to the Federated States of Micronesia. In addition, the U.S. military sailed an aircraft carrier strike group into the South China Sea to conduct war drills with Marines, and secured an agreement with the Philippines to gain access to 4 more military bases. So, the U.S. complains about this one Chinese balloon, but the U.S. is doing a lot militarily to build up against China. This is the last story I'll get to today. The U.S. may have shot down a small hobby balloon with a Sidewinder missile. This is unbelievable. I talked about with Scott Horton on his show on Friday. By the way, I was on the Scott Horton show again, so everybody check out that interview. I think I did pretty well this time. The U.S. may have shot down a small hobby balloon with a Sidewinder missile. President Biden on Thursday acknowledged that there was 3 unidentified objects he ordered the U.S. military to shoot down were likely harmless weather balloons. The intelligence community's current assessment is that these 3 objects were most likely balloons tied to private companies, recreation, or research institutions studying the weather or conducting other scientific research. Following a panic caused by a Chinese balloon that floated over the United States, U.S. fighter jets shot down unidentified objects on February 10th, 11th, and 12th using a heat-seeking AIM-9X Sidewinder missile worth about $400,000 apiece. Biden says the military is working to collect the debris. Our military and the Canadian military are seeking to recover the debris so we can learn more about these objects. According to a report from Aviation Week, at least one of the objects may have been a hobby balloon reported missing by the club in Illinois that launched small balloons with tracking devices that are capable of traveling the globe at high altitude. The club, the Northern Illinois Bottle Cap Balloon Brigade, NIBBB, said the balloon was last reported over the coast of Alaska on February 10th, and tracking data projected that it would be floating over the area of Canada's Yukon Territory on February 11th, the same day a US F-22 shot down a balloon in the region. The balloon they launched was known as a Pico balloon, a small silver-coated party-style balloon that carries a transmitter, and the Pentagon memo described it as an object that was shot down over Canada as a small metallic balloon with a tethered payload below it. And so Dave has a picture here of, I believe, one of the members actually launching. I don't know if it's the balloon or a similar balloon, but you can see that this thing is not much larger than what you would buy for a kid's birthday party, for $20 at the checkout aisle. Canada's authorities said that the object was shot down, was traveling at approximately 40,000 feet. When Nib's balloon was last reported, it was floating at 38,900 feet. The Nib isn't blaming the US government for shooting down his balloon yet, and sometimes the transmitters turn off for a few days, but they think it's a real possibility. Ron Meadows, the founder of the Scientific Balloon Solutions, a company that makes the Pico balloons, told Aviation Weekly they tried to contact the government to tell them they were likely shooting down these balloons. I tried contacting our military and the FBI and just got the runaround, tried to line them that what these things are or probably are, and they're going to look not too intelligent to be shooting them down, Meadows said. According to Aviation Week, the Pico balloons can usually be purchased from $12 to $180 each, depending on the type. Rocky Mountain Ham Radio, another group that launches hobby balloons, described the balloon as a 3-foot mylar full party balloon filled partly with pure helium and carrying a 13-gram solar-powered APRS transmitter. The balloon is intended to travel long distances, not to achieve heights, and is intended to be recovered. These balloons literally circumvent the globe even multiple times before finally descending. And so, I don't know if, this is a humiliation for the US, right? Like, we use a fighter jet to shoot down a party balloon. This is unbelievably stupid, wasteful, and probably pretty dangerous that our government is able to be worked into such an hysteria. They will use such advanced military equipment to shoot down absolutely nothing that present a threat to anyone. So, all right, that's where I'm wrapping up the show for today, everyone. Back with more shows later in the week. Thanks for tuning in.